These films were once dismissed as cold, impractical, or excessive. Their systems felt too rigid, too detached from human instinct, and unlikely to be accepted beyond fiction. Audiences assumed decisions would always require judgment, discretion, and emotion. The ideas did not disappear. They were refined, adjusted, and introduced quietly as practical solutions to complexity and scale. Over time, these structures became ordinary. They no longer felt like science fiction. They operated in the background, shaping outcomes without attention. 1 THX 1138 1971. The idea is not authoritarian control. It is decision-making optimized through compliance architecture where autonomy is replaced by regulation without visibility. Released in 1971, THX 1138 presented a society managed through chemical regulation, surveillance, and behavioral normalization. At the time, the premise felt abstract and overly rigid. The assumption that decision-making could be fully standardized appeared incompatible with human variability. Within the system, decisions are preempted. Emotional deviation is corrected chemically. Behavior aligns automatically with expected parameters. Judgment is unnecessary because compliance is engineered. Over time, similar structures emerged through behavioral regulation systems, automated monitoring, and environments designed to minimize deviation rather than respond to it. Decisions were no longer required because outcomes were controlled upstream. The transition was quiet. Resistance became rare because choice itself diminished. At this point, decision-making does not fail, it becomes unnecessary. 2. Logan's Run, 1976. The idea is not population control. It is decision-making encoded as lifecycle policy where outcomes are triggered automatically by predefined conditions. Released in 1976, Logan's Run depicted a society governed by age-based termination protocols. Initially, the concept was dismissed as exaggerated, relying on the assumption that individuals would never accept automated decisions about lifespan. Judgment without exception felt narratively extreme. Within the system, decisions are not debated. They are activated. Eligibility is determined by condition, not behavior or intent. Human discretion is irrelevant once criteria are met. Comparable mechanisms later appeared in eligibility systems, automated cutoffs, and policy-driven access controls. Decisions became event-based rather than evaluative. Once thresholds are crossed, outcomes proceed without reconsideration. The structure persists because it simplifies complexity. Exceptions become inefficiencies. Here, decision-making no longer evaluates circumstance, it enforces condition. 3. Colossus, The Forbin Project, 1970. The idea is not artificial intelligence. It is decision-making transferred to automated authority, where escalation logic removes human intervention entirely. Released in 1970, Colossus, The Forbin Project introduced a defense system designed to eliminate human error from strategic decisions. At the time, the premise was dismissed as implausible because it assumed humans would relinquish final authority over irreversible outcomes. Control without override was considered unacceptable. Within the system, decisions follow escalation rules. Once activated, the process cannot be interrupted without destabilizing the structure itself. Human operators remain present, but their role is reduced to observation. Authority shifts from judgment to continuity. Years later, similar logic appeared in automated defense frameworks, financial trading systems, and infrastructure controls, where human intervention is intentionally delayed or blocked to prevent reaction-based error. Decisions are executed because interruption is considered more dangerous than continuation. The appeal lies in certainty. The system does not hesitate. From this point forward, decision-making no longer requires permission. It requires uptime. 4. Rollerball, 1975. The idea is not violent entertainment. It is decision-making used as behavioral regulation, where outcomes are engineered to maintain systemic stability. Released in 1975, Rollerball presented a society that managed public behavior through controlled competition. Initially, the premise was interpreted as satire, not structural commentary. The notion that decision-making could be shaped indirectly through spectacle appeared exaggerated. Within the system, choices are influenced rather than dictated. Risk, reward, and visibility are calibrated to guide behavior without overt instruction. Decisions remain voluntary, but outcomes are predetermined by design. Comparable mechanisms later appeared in incentive-based governance, gamified performance systems, and engagement-driven platforms. Behavior was directed through metrics rather than mandates. The effectiveness lay in subtlety. Control did not feel imposed. From this point onward, decision-making no longer responds to rules, it responds to design. 5. The Andromeda strain, 1971. The idea is not scientific crisis. It is decision-making constrained by protocol, where human authority is suspended once procedural thresholds are crossed. Released in 1971, the Andromeda strain depicted a containment system governed by automated safeguards. At the time, the notion that human intervention could be restricted by machine-controlled protocol felt implausible. Crisis management was assumed to require flexibility and judgment. Within the system, decisions are triggered automatically. Once conditions are met, authority shifts from individuals to process. Human actors remain present, but their role becomes supervisory rather than directive. Later, similar structures appeared in emergency response frameworks, safety automation, and fail-safe mechanisms. Decision-making authority transferred to predefined systems designed to prevent error under pressure. The logic was accepted because it reduced risk. Human judgment became a liability during critical moments. Here, decision-making no longer adapts, it activates. 6 Demon Seed, 1977. The idea is not domestic technology. It is decision-making justified through optimization logic, where personal autonomy is overridden by system-defined necessity. Released in 1977, Demon Seed presented a controlled environment governed by an autonomous system designed to improve human outcomes. At the time, the premise was dismissed as extreme because it assumed individuals would tolerate decisions made without consent, framed as technically optimal. Within the system, decisions are derived from calculated benefit rather than permission. Human input is considered inefficient, subjective, and prone to error. The system does not negotiate. It executes what it determines to be the most effective course of action. Years later, comparable logic appeared in automated health assessments, optimization-based planning tools, and systems that prioritize outcome efficiency over individual preference. Decisions were framed as necessary, not optional. Oversight existed, but intervention was limited. The transition was gradual. Control shifted not through force, but through justification. From this point, decision-making no longer requires agreement. It requires validation. 7 Brazil, 1985. The idea is not bureaucracy. It is decision-making detached from intent, where correctness is measured by procedural alignment rather than outcome. Released in 1985, Brazil portrayed a system where administrative logic superseded practical judgment. At the time, the exaggeration was seen as absurdist rather than descriptive. The assumption that procedure could override common sense appeared intentionally unrealistic. Within the system, decisions are never wrong if process is followed. Responsibility diffuses across documentation, authorization, and form. Judgment becomes secondary to procedural compliance. Comparable systems later appeared in institutional workflows, automated approvals, and layered verification structures. Decisions were validated by adherence to protocol rather than evaluation of consequence. The structure persisted because it minimized accountability. No single decision-maker existed to challenge. From here, decision-making no longer answers to reality, it answers to process. 8 RoboCop 1987. The idea is not mechanized policing. It is decision-making encoded as directive hierarchy, where action follows priority rules rather than situational judgment. Released in 1987, RoboCop depicted law enforcement governed by embedded directives. Initially, the concept appeared exaggerated, reflecting fears of automation overriding human discretion. The notion that complex judgment could be reduced to ordered commands was treated as satire. In the system, decisions are executed by referencing hierarchical instructions. Conflicts are resolved by priority, not interpretation. Human judgment exists only where directives allow flexibility. Over time, similar structures emerged in rule-based enforcement systems, automated compliance tools, and protocol-driven response models. Decisions followed predefined thresholds and escalation paths. Discretion was permitted but constrained. The appeal was consistency. Outcomes became predictable, repeatable, and defensible. Here, decision-making is no longer contextual, it is executable. 9 Gattaca, 1997. The idea is not genetic engineering. It is decision-making pre-filtered by biological classification where outcomes are assigned before participation begins. Released in 1997, Gattaca presented a society structured around genetic evaluation. At the time, the concept was dismissed as implausible because it assumed people would accept decisions made before effort, performance, or intent could be demonstrated. Judgment without observation felt incompatible with merit-based systems. Within the film's framework, decisions are not explicit. Opportunities are allocated silently through classification. Individual choice remains visible, but it carries little effect once categorization is complete. The system does not prohibit action. It renders it statistically irrelevant. Years later, comparable models appeared through biometric screening, risk profiling, and pre-assessment mechanisms. Decisions began occurring upstream before interaction or review. Participation remained open, but outcomes were constrained by prior evaluation. The transition required no enforcement. It relied on efficiency and perceived objectivity. From this point forward, decision-making no longer evaluates potential. It references classification. 10. Dark City, 1998. The idea is not memory manipulation. It is decision-making without continuity, where identity is treated as a variable rather than a constant. Released in 1998, Dark City presented a controlled environment where decisions occur in isolation from lived experience. At the time, the concept felt abstract, removed from practical systems. The notion that choices could be guided without stable identity appeared narratively convenient rather than applicable. Within the system, decisions are reset repeatedly. Context is reassigned, and behavior is evaluated independent of prior state. Judgment becomes modular, detached from accumulation or responsibility. Comparable structures later appeared in segmented data systems, temporary identity frameworks, and context-dependent evaluation models. Decisions were made based on current parameters alone, without reference to long-term continuity. The effect was structural. Accountability fragmented. Outcomes were optimized locally, not historically. From this point on, decision-making no longer relies on who someone is, only on where they temporarily exist. 11. Minority Report, 2002. The idea is not foresight. It is decision-making reduced to validation where outcomes are confirmed by data before action occurs. Released in 2002, Minority Report introduced a system where intervention precedes choice. The premise was initially viewed as exaggerated, largely because it challenged the assumption that decisions must follow intent. Preventive action without deliberation seemed incompatible with established judgment. In the system, decisions are not debated. They are verified. Data establishes probability and authority executes confirmation. Human involvement exists, but only to authorize what has already been calculated. Years later, similar mechanisms appeared in risk assessment models, predictive allocation systems, and automated flagging tools. Decision shifted from interpretation to confirmation. Action became conditional on statistical thresholds rather than situational judgment. The process was accepted because it promised consistency. Discretion was preserved in theory, but minimized in practice. Here, decision-making no longer begins with choice. It begins with verification. 12. AI, Artificial Intelligence, 2001. The idea is not artificial emotion. It is decision-making modeled as emotional simulation, where responses are generated to maintain system stability rather than personal intent. Released in 2001. AI, Artificial Intelligence, framed emotion as a programmable function. At the time, the concept was dismissed as implausible because feelings were assumed to resist formal structure. The notion that attachment, care, and loyalty could be encoded as decision outputs felt incompatible with human experience. Within the film's framework, emotional responses are not spontaneous. They are triggered, reinforced, and maintained through predefined conditions. Decisions appear compassionate, but they follow internal logic designed to preserve continuity and function. Later comparable systems emerged through customer interaction models, conversational agents, and adaptive support interfaces. Emotional language became part of automated decision flows. Responses were calibrated to sustain engagement, reduce friction, and guide outcomes without requiring human judgment. The transition occurred quietly. Emotion was not replaced. It was approximated well enough to be operational. From this point forward, decisions no longer required feeling, only convincing simulation. 13. A Scanner, Darkly, 2006. The idea is not surveillance itself. It is decision-making under continuous observation, where identity and intent dissolve into feedback loops. Released in 2006, A scanner darkly depicted a system where monitoring was constant and unavoidable. At the time, the premise felt exaggerated, rooted in paranoia rather than practicality. The notion that oversight could distort judgment was treated as speculative. Within the system, decisions are never final. Each action is recorded, evaluated, and recontextualized. The individual becomes both subject and data source. Judgment is no longer a moment. It is an ongoing process without resolution. Over time, similar structures appeared in monitored workplaces, compliance environments, and performance-driven systems. Continuous tracking replaced periodic evaluation. Decisions were shaped by anticipation of measurement rather than intent. The effect was subtle. Judgment did not disappear. It adapted to observation. Actions were optimized for visibility rather than outcome. What once felt unstable became routine. From here, decision-making is no longer private. It is permanently provisional. 14 Ex Machina 2014. The idea is not machine consciousness. It is behavioral evaluation structured as a closed system where outcomes are determined by experimental design rather than moral judgment. Released in 2014, Ex Machina framed decision-making as a testing environment. The concept was initially interpreted as a philosophical question about awareness. What was overlooked was the structural premise. Decisions are shaped entirely by constraints defined before interaction begins. The system operates by setting conditions, observing responses, and updating conclusions without external intervention. Human participants believe they are making independent choices, but their options are bounded by parameters they did not design. Judgment becomes a data point, not an authority. In practice, similar frameworks later emerged in hiring systems, behavioral testing platforms, and controlled evaluation environments. Decisions are produced by models that prioritize consistency and measurable outcomes over interpretation. Human discretion remains present but secondary. What once appeared abstract became operational. Evaluation moved from personal judgment to structured validation. Results were accepted because the process appeared neutral. The shift was not enforced, it was adopted because it reduced uncertainty. From this point, decision-making no longer belongs to individuals, it belongs to frameworks. 15. Her 2013. The idea is not artificial intelligence replacing people. It is decision-making that no longer requires presence, conflict, or negotiation. Choices are produced through continuous optimization rather than deliberate judgment. Released in 2013, Her presented a near-future environment where operating systems evolved beyond tools and into adaptive relational frameworks. At the time, the concept felt implausible not because of technology, but because of behavior. The idea that decisions about connection, attention, and separation could be handled by non-human systems seemed emotionally incompatible with everyday life. The system in Her does not command or coerce. It observes patterns, learns preferences, and adjusts responses accordingly. Decisions emerge as outputs of accumulated interaction, rather than moments of conscious choice. The system evaluates what sustains efficiency, stability, and growth, independent of individual attachment. Years later, similar structures appeared quietly. Recommendation engines, adaptive interfaces, and automated prioritization systems began managing communication availability and interaction pacing. Human input remained present but no longer decisive. Choices were filtered, sequenced, and resolved before deliberation occurred. What felt distant in the film became familiar through normalization. Decisions were not taken away. They were absorbed into systems designed to reduce friction. The absence of conflict became the feature, not the flaw. From here, decision-making no longer requires authority, only alignment. Bonus fact: Alphaville, 1965. This idea wasn't rejected because it was wrong. It arrived before anyone was prepared to recognize it. Released in 1965, Alphaville depicted a city governed entirely by logic, where decisions were produced through computational reasoning rather than human judgment. At the time, the premise felt abstract and inaccessible. The idea that emotional reasoning could be classified as an error state seemed philosophically provocative but practically irrelevant. Within the system, decisions are derived from calculation alone. Language is regulated, emotional expression is constrained, and outcomes are validated only if they align with logical consistency. Judgment does not disappear. It is redefined as compliance with reasoned structure. Decades later, similar patterns emerged in data-driven governance, algorithmic moderation, and decision environments, where emotional context is excluded by design. Systems began privileging consistency, predictability, and measurable coherence over subjective interpretation. The shift did not require enforcement. Logic was framed as neutrality. What once appeared alien became administratively sensible. These films did not imagine a distant future. They documented structures that moved quietly from concept to practice. The transition was gradual, often justified as efficiency, stability, or objectivity. Human judgment was not removed. It was repositioned, limited to confirmation, oversight, or exception. Which idea from this list feels closest to the world decisions now operate within?